It started with a friend request. On an otherwise unremarkable Thursday evening, as Julia scrolled through Facebook on her tablet with one hand and sipped Pinot Noir with the other, there it was. Mark Delaney has sent you a friend request. Her heart hiccuped. Mark Delaney, high school sweetheart. The boy who kissed her under the bleachers after the spring talent show. The boy who wrote her poems in the margins of his textbooks. The boy she swore she'd love forever, until life, college, time, and 2 marriages drifted them apart like leaves on different rivers. She stared at the name. The profile picture was grainy, probably cropped from a group photo. His hair was grayer, his face a little fuller, but the eyes, those sharp, curious, golden brown eyes, were exactly the same. Still full of mischief. Still slightly narrowed, like he was always about to challenge you to a game, or a dare, or a dream. She tapped accept. That small click echoed like thunder in her chest. They messaged that night. Tentative at first, the way you poke around a memory that's too delicate to touch head-on. Mark was in Chicago now, a financial consultant with 2 grown kids. Divorced. Recently, but amicably, he said. He'd just joined Facebook because his daughter insisted. To stop living in the Stone Age, he joked. Julia chuckled when she read it. She remembered that boy. Always charming, always quick with humor to soften the truth. They chatted about high school, Mr. Connor's unbearable pop quizzes, the winter dance disaster, their senior prank that got them both detention for a week. The old feelings didn't rush in all at once. They unfurled slowly, like steam rising from a cup of tea. But something was waking up in her. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. 2 days later, Mark sent her a song. A Spotify link to Harvest Moon by Neil Young. That was their song. He didn't say anything with the link. Just sent it. Julia didn't respond immediately. She listened to the song with her eyes closed, breathing deeply as a tear she didn't expect slipped down her cheek. Her husband, Alan, was watching TV in the other room. They'd been married for 19 years. He was kind, reliable, never raised his voice, never forgot her birthday. But he hadn't touched her with desire in nearly 5 years. He hadn't looked at her the way Mark used to. Like she was the most dangerously beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She typed back, "Still our song." And with that, the line was crossed. Not physically. Not yet. But emotionally? Emotionally, she had already stepped outside the gate and left it swinging in the wind. The first phone call came 4 days later. Julia answered it in the car, parked in front of her Pilates class, but suddenly indifferent to core strength and flexibility. "Hey, Jules," he said. Nobody called her that anymore. The sound of his voice was older, deeper, but it struck something primal inside her. Like a chord had been strummed from across decades. They talked for 47 minutes. They didn't talk about sex or anything overtly forbidden. But it was there, thick between the words. The way he said her name. The slight rasp in his voice when he told her he used to dream about her walking across the gym in that red sweater. How he never forgot the way she bit her lip when she was nervous. Julia found herself smiling like a teenager, laughing too loud, tucking her hair behind her ear even though no one could see her. She didn't go into class that day. She sat there in the driver's seat, suspended between 2 lives, the one she lived and the one that was calling her back. That weekend, she started dressing differently. A bit of blush, a softer blouse, perfume. Not that Alan noticed, but she noticed. Mark noticed. And then came the suggestion. "I'll be in Boston in 2 weeks for a conference," Mark said. "Just 2 days. But maybe we could grab coffee." Julia didn't answer for a long time. Her hands were sweating. Her breath caught. "Just coffee," he said again, voice low. "In public. If that's all it can be." But they both knew it wasn't just coffee. And if she said yes, which she would, it would mean opening a door that might never close again. Julia sat by the window of her home office the morning after she said yes. She watched the autumn leaves twist down from the trees like slow confetti. In the quiet hum of the house, there was something else, a pulse, a hunger, not just for Mark, but for the version of herself he awakened. She didn't tell Alan about the meeting. She didn't lie either. She just left out the details. Said she was meeting an old friend for coffee. Technically, that was true, but the truth had branches. Mark hadn't always been the one that got away. Back in high school, he was the boy with big dreams but no concrete plans. He wanted to see the world, be a photographer, or maybe a musician, or maybe just anything that didn't require a tie. Julia was the opposite, goal-oriented, focused, driven. While Mark skipped class to write lyrics in spiral notebooks, Julia stayed late to work on the yearbook layout and revise her essays. He made her laugh when she took herself too seriously. She made him want to be a better version of himself. They were fire and wind, too wild to last, too intense to forget. They broke up the summer before college. No drama, just diverging paths. He went west. She went east. Over the years, they lost touch, each swallowed by marriages, jobs, children, and duty. The love had faded like old photographs, never torn, never burned, just quietly stored in the attic of memory. Until now. What no one told Julia was that even the happiest life could feel like a cage when you didn't fit inside yourself anymore. On paper, she had everything. A thriving real estate career. A solid marriage. A house with crown molding and French doors. But the spark was gone. The one that made her laugh so hard she snorted. The one that used to send chills down her spine when a man she adored looked at her like she was the only woman in the room. Alan didn't look at her that way anymore. Maybe he did once. She couldn't remember. He was more of a fixture now. Warm, familiar, reliable. Like the antique lamp in the hallway. Always there, always functional, but never noticed unless the bulb burned out. Julia didn't want chaos. She didn't want to blow up her life. But she wanted to feel. The day of the coffee date, she spent too long getting ready. Tried on 3 different dresses before settling on the navy one with the soft neckline. Elegant but casual. She told herself it was just coffee. She even rehearsed what she'd say, polite, distant boundaries. And then she saw him, standing near the cafe's front door, hands in the pockets of his camel coat, looking both older and exactly the same. The smile when he saw her was effortless. "Jules," he breathed, pulling her into a hug that was too long, too tight, and completely unforgettable. The cafe was warm, dimly lit. Jazz music drifted through the air. They sat in the back corner booth. She ordered a chai latte. He got black coffee, no sugar. Like always, they talked. And talked. About careers. Kids. Divorces. Regret. Dreams deferred. Passion delayed. He said he never remarried after his divorce. Tried dating, but nothing stuck. Nothing real. Then he looked at her and said, "I used to look you up every few years. Wonder how you were doing. But I never reached out. I thought, if you were happy, I shouldn't interfere." Julia didn't know what to say. So she said what was safe. "I am happy." And she was. Sometimes. In the safe, quiet, grown-up way that felt more like peace than joy. But then Mark reached across the table. Touched her hand. "You don't have to lie to me, Jules. Not now." Later that night, Julia stood in the bathroom staring at her own reflection. She touched her lips like they belonged to someone else. They hadn't kissed, not yet, but she could feel the nearness of it. The inevitability. The way he looked at her across the table. The way he leaned in. The way her whole body responded. Not with guilt, but with recognition. Something inside her, something ancient and starved, was clawing its way to the surface. She wasn't a reckless woman. She wasn't cruel. She had spent decades doing the right thing. Holding the house together. Managing everyone else's emotions. Being the grown-up. The caretaker. The responsible one. But something had shifted. This wasn't just about Mark. It was about who she had been before the expectations, before the schedules, before the quiet domesticity dulled her edges. She missed that girl. And Mark, somehow, had found her. When he texted her later that night, "I can't stop thinking about today." I miss you already." She didn't hesitate this time. "Me too." And that was the moment the longing rooted itself. Not in nostalgia, not in lust, but in truth. The truth that love doesn't always die when it ends. Sometimes it goes dormant, waiting, until the spark returns. They met again a week later. It wasn't planned. At least, that's what Julia told herself. Mark texted that he was still in town for an extra day. She didn't need to respond. She could have ignored it, closed the phone, gone back to slicing onions for the soup Alan liked. But she didn't. Instead, she typed back, "Meet me at 3. Same cafe." When she arrived, he was already there, a book in hand, his coat slung over the back of the booth. He looked up and smiled, not the careful, polite smile of an old friend, but a smile of knowing. A smile that said, "We've both crossed the same invisible line." They didn't talk about their spouses or children or responsibilities. They talked about music, about places they wanted to go, about nothing and everything, the way people do when they're floating in a moment that feels separate from the rest of life. Then at the end, he walked her to her car, and the goodbye lingered too long. He cupped her face, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will all be a dream," he said. She didn't respond. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was slow, soft, but filled with a hunger that came not just from passion, but from years of being unseen. Julia drove home with trembling hands. Not from guilt, from clarity. She hadn't felt that alive in years. Her skin buzzed. Her thoughts swirled. It was as if she'd stepped into a forgotten self, one that laughed too loud, kissed with abandon, and didn't ask permission to want more. And yet, when she walked into the house and Alan greeted her with his usual, "Hey babe, how was your day?" she felt the first true stab of unease. Because nothing in his tone suggested suspicion, or attention, or curiosity. Just routine. Comfortable, beige, numb routine. She mumbled something about errands and went upstairs. Desire has ripples. And these ripples don't just stay inside you. They move through your choices, your silences, your half-hearted touches, your distracted smiles. They bend reality until you don't know where the lie ends and the truth begins. Over the next few days, Julia found herself pulling away. Alan noticed, but not enough. He assumed she was stressed about work. He didn't press. That's the thing about slow love, it can miss the moments that matter. Julia began checking her phone like a teenager again, heart skipping at every vibration. Texts from Mark became the highlight of her days. "I saw a woman today who reminded me of you. She wasn't as beautiful, of course. Remember that dive bar we used to sneak into? Still standing. Want to go sometime? I dreamt about you last night. You were wearing that red sweater again." She blushed reading that, and then felt stupid for blushing, and then felt alive for feeling anything at all. But the real shift happened not in a kiss or a text, but in a moment of absolute stillness. She was sitting in the garden one evening, watching the wind move through the hydrangeas. Alan came out, brought her tea, kissed her forehead like always. And it hit her. This life, while stable and safe, had slowly erased her. Not because of malice, not because of betrayal, but because somewhere along the way, she had stopped asking for more. And now, someone was offering it freely, fiercely, with no conditions except presence. A week later, Mark booked a hotel room. She didn't ask him to. He didn't pressure her, but he sent her the address. Just in case. She stared at the message for an hour before responding. "I'll think about it." But she already knew. She bought new lingerie the next day. Not trashy, not loud, just beautiful, soft, elegant, something that made her feel like a woman again, not just a wife or a mother or a dependable business partner. The night of the hotel rendezvous, Julia told Alan she had a client dinner. He didn't question it, didn't notice her perfume, or the silk under her coat. She took a cab. The hotel was discreet. Mark was waiting in the lobby, nervous in a way that made her heart ache. They didn't rush. He touched her like someone remembering a song he thought was lost. She trembled in his arms, not from fear, but from being found. They spent hours just talking, holding each other, exploring each other again, not just physically, but emotionally. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered name peeled back years of silence. They didn't speak of consequences, or endings, or definitions. They just existed, fully, naked, honest, desperate. Afterward, lying beside him with her head on his chest, Julia whispered, "I don't know what this is." Mark kissed the top of her head and said, "It's real. That's all I know." And somehow that was enough. For now. It began with music. Julia sat in her car, parked just outside her office. A familiar song played, an old 90s ballad Mark had once sung to her in a hushed voice during their last summer before college. It wasn't a particularly great song, but it held the fingerprint of a moment she'd locked away. And as she sat there, 30 years older, married, respected, with her life laid out like a perfectly ironed map, she cried. Not the sharp, jagged cry of grief, but the slow, aching tears of someone realizing that somewhere along the way, she had chosen safety over herself. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she regretted it, or if she was just finally waking up. Mark didn't demand anything from her. That's what made it harder and more intoxicating. He didn't ask her to leave Alan. He didn't try to define their stolen hours. He just showed up. Texts, meetings, weekend mornings at that little beach town where no one knew their names. They didn't call it an affair. They called it ours. He brought her coffee just the way she liked it, sent her poems without authors. Once he mailed her a book, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, with a note inside, "You don't owe anyone your silence." And she began to believe it. Julia's friends noticed changes. "You seem lighter," one said over brunch. "Like you're glowing. Are you doing yoga?" Julia smiled, the kind that carries secrets. Something like that. But at home, the glow became harder to hide. Alan, always comfortable in routine, began asking subtle questions. "You've been out a lot lately, client stuff?" "Yeah," Julia would reply, eyes on her phone, thumbs trembling with replies she never sent out loud. Alan wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant. He simply wasn't Mark. And perhaps more damning, she wasn't herself around Alan anymore. With Mark, she laughed from her belly, not her throat. With Mark, she argued, teased, flirted, fully alive. With Alan, she maintained. One night, Julia stood in the mirror brushing her hair. Alan walked in and watched her. His eyes scanned her reflection for a long time. "You look beautiful," he said, voice soft, unsure. She turned, smiled, and replied, "Thank you." But something broke in her then. Not out of betrayal, but realization. She didn't want to lie anymore. Not to him. Not to herself. She met Mark at the lake house the following weekend. They made love for hours. Not urgently, not like teenagers, but as two people who knew the value of time and had chosen to spend it dangerously. Afterward, tangled in sheets, her head on his chest, Julia whispered, "I think I need to tell him." Mark didn't say, finally. He didn't press. He simply kissed her forehead and said, "You owe yourself the truth." It wasn't about leaving Alan for Mark. It wasn't even about Mark. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself she'd let fade. The wildness, the craving, the bold hunger for more than just predictable companionship. She wanted to choose her life, not inherit it by default. She wanted love that felt like recognition, not administration. So, the next week, Julia sat across from Alan at the dinner table. The kids were grown. The house was quiet. She reached for his hand, and he flinched slightly, not from anger but from shock. "I need to talk to you," she began. And then she told him. Not the graphic details, but the truth. The ache. The absence. The rediscovery. The man. Alan didn't speak for a long time. And then he asked the one question she feared. "Do you love him?" She paused. Her throat tightened. Her heart ached. "I love who I am with him," she said softly. "And I miss who I was before I forgot how to want." It wasn't a dramatic end. Alan didn't scream. Julia didn't storm out. There was no suitcase, no slammed doors. Just a long, brutal silence. And then quiet grief. The mourning of a story that had gone on too long without revision. They agreed to time, to space, to kindness. And that was how Julia surrendered. Not to Mark, not to fantasy, but to truth, to feeling, to herself. The first night she slept alone, she didn't cry. She lay awake for hours, listening to the stillness. She walked through her home barefoot, touched the walls like they were old friends. In the morning, she made strong coffee. She sat by the window. And when Mark texted, "Thinking of you," she replied. "Me too. Let's talk soon." But not yet. Because this time, she wasn't rushing into someone else's arms. She was standing on her own. The surrender wasn't about losing anything. It was about gaining back everything she'd shelved for later. And for the first time in decades, Julia knew what she wanted. She wasn't chasing youth. She wasn't chasing chaos. She was choosing love, the real kind. The dangerous, truthful, inconvenient kind that refuses to fit neatly inside socially accepted boxes. And in that, she was free. Spring came quietly that year. Julia had moved into a small apartment on the east side of the city. It had creaky floors, too much sunlight, and a view of the park that looked different depending on her mood. She chose it herself, not for convenience, not for prestige, but because it felt like hers. No one had opinions about the curtains. No one asked when dinner would be ready. No one needed anything. It was both terrifying and sacred. She hadn't seen Mark in 6 weeks. Not because she was avoiding him, but because she was finding herself again, outside of any man's shadow. She took long walks, caught up with friends she'd ignored for years, started writing in a journal. Once, she even went to the movies alone and cried during the previews. Not from sadness, but from how radically unfamiliar it felt to be alone and at peace. And yet, in the quiet corners of the day, she still thought of him. Mark, the boy who had kissed her under the bleachers with trembling hands. Mark, the man who saw her not just as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as a woman, full, flawed, complicated, alive. One evening, she found a letter in her mailbox. Handwritten. No return address. She knew the handwriting immediately. "Julia, I've waited to write this. I didn't want to take from you the stillness you've earned. But if the door is still open, even just a crack, I'd like to walk through it. No expectations. Just the hope that we still matter. Mark." She folded the letter and held it to her chest. Not because she needed to decide anything right away, but because she realized something monumental. She no longer needed him to complete her, but she wanted him to join her. They met in a bookstore. Quiet, poetic, cliché, and perfect. He stood by the poetry section, holding Neruda. She walked in wearing no makeup, hair in a bun, oversized coat. He looked at her like she was a miracle. And maybe she was. They didn't kiss. Not at first. They just stood close. Let the silence breathe. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "I'm becoming," she replied. And that was enough. Love, Julia had learned, doesn't always roar in like a storm. Sometimes it returns like a memory, gentle, persistent, undeniable. She and Mark began again, slowly, deliberately. They met for coffee, walked in the park, took weekend trips. No more hiding, no more guilt. Just two people building something from choice, not from need. They talked about the past, but they didn't live in it. Mark had his own journey too. He had gone through therapy, left the job he hated, started painting again. "You cracked something open in me," he said once. "Turns out I liked what came out." Months passed. Alan emailed her once, a short note, distant but kind. He was seeing someone new. The kids had adjusted. Life was moving as it always does. And Julia felt no regret. Only gratitude that she had dared to disrupt the comfort of a life that no longer held her truth. The final revelation came not in a dramatic kiss or a candlelit dinner. It came one ordinary afternoon, sitting on a park bench, watching a mother chase her toddler. Mark leaned in and said, "You know, we're not promised this. Any of it." "I know," Julia whispered. "But I choose you. Every day." She looked at him, older, a little wrinkled, still devastatingly warm, and replied, "And I choose myself first. Then you." And in that there was no selfishness. Only liberation. Because that's what real love is. Not the act of losing yourself in another, but of becoming whole enough to invite someone in without breaking. They never moved in together. Julia kept her apartment. Mark had his place by the coast. They spent weekends together. Shared keys, not obligations. Celebrated birthdays, grieved losses, held space for each other without swallowing the other whole. And for Julia, this love, wild in its honesty, tender in its pace, rooted in freedom, was the one she never knew she needed. Her friends still asked questions. "Will you remarry? Don't you get lonely? Do you miss the stability?" She answered with a smile and a shrug. "I've never felt more stable than I do in my own skin." One rainy evening, Julia stood at her window with a cup of tea, watching the drops blur the city lights. She wasn't in love the way movies showed it. There were no grand speeches in the rain. No jealous fights or breathless reunions. She was in love the way grown women fall, with clarity, with gentleness, with knowing. Love's truest form, she had discovered, isn't about rescue. It's about recognition. It's the man who remembers your coffee order. The one who listens when you speak softly. The one who holds you, not to possess you, but to witness you. And it's about choosing yourself without apology. That night, Mark texted her. "Tomorrow. Sunrise. The lake. I'll bring coffee." She smiled. Typed back. "I'll bring the silence."